My grandpa sat across from me at the small cafe table, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and asked with genuine confusion in his eyes, "So, Natalie, do you like the lake house I bought you?" I set down my fork, my heart suddenly racing, and replied carefully, "Grandpa, what lake house?" The smile that had been forming on his face disappeared, replaced by something that looked like alarm, then anger, then a determination I had rarely seen before. That single moment of confusion shattered everything I thought I knew about my family, and revealed a betrayal so calculated that it would take me months to fully understand its depth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Natalie Foster, and that morning at the cafe was not the first time I had noticed something wrong in my family dynamics, but it was the first time I could no longer ignore the evidence that had been accumulating for years. I am 28 years old, living in Portland, working as a middle school art teacher, a profession that my parents have never quite forgiven me for choosing. They had envisioned something more impressive for their only daughter, something that would look better in Christmas letters and casual mentions at their country club gatherings. An art teacher at an underfunded public school did not fit their narrative of success. My relationship with my parents, Richard and Melissa Foster, had always existed in a strange territory between genuine affection and performance art. They loved me in the way that people love possessions that reflect well on them. When I achieved things they could discuss proudly with their social circle, their warmth felt authentic and generous. When I made choices that did not align with their vision of an impressive life, their love became conditional and transactional, offered or withdrawn based on my compliance with their expectations. My grandfather, William Foster, represented something entirely different in my life. He was my father's father, a man who had built a successful regional construction company through decades of hard work, integrity, and genuine relationships with the communities he served. While my parents had inherited enough wealth to live comfortably without working particularly hard, Grandpa William had started with nothing and built everything through skill, persistence, and an unwavering commitment to doing things correctly even when shortcuts were available. He was 82 years old now, still sharp and engaged despite some physical slowing that frustrated him. He had retired from active management of his company 5 years earlier, transitioning leadership to a team of employees he had mentored for decades rather than to my father, who had never shown interest in actually learning the construction business despite being happy to benefit from its profits. My father had pursued what he called strategic consulting, which seemed to involve a great deal of networking and very little actual consulting, while my mother dedicated herself to charitable committee work that was more about social positioning than genuine service. I had always been closer to Grandpa William than to my parents, though I had not fully understood why until I was well into adulthood. He treated me like a complete person rather than a reflection of his aspirations. He asked about my students and actually listened to my answers. He wanted to know what I was reading, what ideas interested me, what challenges I was navigating. He remembered details from previous conversations and followed up on things I had mentioned weeks earlier. When I told him about a difficult situation with a student or a frustration with school administration, he offered perspective rather than solutions, trusting that I had the capability to work through problems rather than needing him to fix everything. My parents, by contrast, asked questions that were really statements about what they wished I would do differently. "How is teaching going?" Really meant, "Have you reconsidered getting your master's degree in educational administration, so you can at least become a principal? Are you seeing anyone?" Really meant, "Why are you still single when your cousin Jennifer is already planning her wedding? What are you working on?" Really meant, "Have you abandoned those impractical art projects and started focusing on career advancement?" The cafe meeting that morning had been Grandpa William's idea. He had called me 3 days earlier and asked if I could meet him for breakfast on Saturday, just the two of us. This was not unusual. We had been having regular breakfast meetings for years, a tradition that started when I was in college and had continued even after I moved back to Portland and started teaching. My parents knew about these meetings and tolerated them with barely concealed irritation, occasionally making comments about how I seemed to have more time for my grandfather than for them, conveniently ignoring that they were usually too busy with their social obligations to make time for simple meals together. I had arrived at the cafe at 8 in the morning, early enough that the weekend brunch crowd had not yet filled the small space. Grandpa William was already there, sitting at our usual table by the window, looking out at the street with an expression I could not quite read. When he saw me, he smiled. But there was something tentative in the smile, something that suggested uncertainty or concern. We had ordered our usual breakfasts. He always got the same thing, scrambled eggs with wheat toast and a side of fruit coffee black. I ordered an omelette with vegetables and whole wheat pancakes, a combination that my mother would have criticized as carb-heavy and unnecessary. We talked about ordinary things for the first 15 minutes. He asked about my students and I told him about a breakthrough one of my struggling artists had experienced that week, finally finding confidence in her own creative vision, rather than trying to replicate what she thought I wanted to see. He told me about a documentary he had watched about the construction of the Hoover Dam, and how it reminded him of the principles he had always tried to bring to his own work, the importance of strong foundations and attention to detail even in elements that would eventually be hidden from view. Then, as our plates were being cleared away and we were settling into the comfortable space of a second cup of coffee, he had shifted the conversation in a direction I was not expecting. "I wanted to talk to you about something important," he had said, his tone becoming more serious. "I have been thinking a lot lately about legacy, and about making sure the people I care about are taken care of properly." I had felt a flutter of concern, wondering if he was about to tell me about health problems he had been hiding. "Grandpa, are you okay? Is something wrong?" He had smiled and reached across the table to pat my hand. "I am fine, sweetheart. This is not about me being sick or anything dramatic. I am just at an age where I want to make sure certain things are handled correctly while I still can." I had relaxed slightly, though I was still not sure where this conversation was heading. "You know I have always been proud of you," he continued. "Not because of impressive achievements or status, though you have plenty of both in ways that actually matter. I am proud because you have integrity. You chose a profession that serves others even though it does not pay particularly well or impress people at cocktail parties. You work with kids who need someone to believe in them. You live within your means and you do not spend your energy trying to look successful rather than actually being valuable." I had felt my throat tighten with emotion. My grandfather's approval had always meant more to me than any recognition from my parents or anyone else, perhaps because it was offered without strings or conditions. "Last spring," he said, "I bought a property up near Lake Oswego. It is a small house right on the water, 2 bedrooms, beautiful views, quiet location. I bought it specifically for you. I had the deed transferred into your name. It has been yours for almost 8 months now." I had stared at him, completely unable to process what he was saying. A house? He had bought me a house? The financial implications alone were staggering, but beyond that, the thoughtfulness of such a gift, the trust it represented, the way it demonstrated he understood what I valued rather than what he thought I should value. "I wanted you to have a place that was truly yours," he continued, watching my face carefully. "Not an apartment where you are building equity for someone else. Not something dependent on your parents' approval or support. A place where you could be yourself completely, where you could create, where you could eventually raise a family if you wanted, or simply live exactly as you choose. I worked with a real estate agent I trust, found something within reasonable distance of your school, made sure the property taxes were manageable. I set up an account to cover taxes and basic maintenance for the first 5 years, so you would not be financially burdened by upkeep." My mind was racing, trying to absorb what he was telling me, while also trying to understand why this was the first I was hearing about it. 8 months. He said he had done this last spring 8 months ago. Why had I not known? Why had nobody told me? "Grandpa," I said slowly, my voice shaking slightly, "I do not understand. You bought me a house 8 months ago? Where is it? What does it look like? Why am I only hearing about this now?" His expression had changed then, the warmth draining away to be replaced by something harder, colder. "You are only hearing about it now? What do you mean?" "I mean I have never heard anything about a lake house. I did not know you bought property. I certainly did not know there was a house in my name. This is the first time anyone has mentioned any of this to me." He had set down his coffee cup very carefully, his hand suddenly shaking slightly. "I told your parents in April when I finalized the purchase. I asked them to take you up to see the property, to help you understand what would be involved in owning it, to make sure you felt comfortable with the responsibility. I gave them the keys, the deed paperwork, all the documentation. Your father assured me they would handle it sensitively, that they would make sure you understood this was not about control or expectations, just about giving you security and independence. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The cafe suddenly felt too warm, the background noise of other conversations too loud. I was trying to make sense of what he was saying, trying to understand how my parents could have known about this for 8 months and said absolutely nothing. Not casually withheld information, but actively concealed something this significant. They never said anything, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. They never mentioned a house, never took me to see any property, never gave me any paperwork. I had no idea any of this existed. Grandpa William's face had flushed with anger, a rare expression for him. He was typically measured and calm, someone who processed emotions privately before responding to situations. But now I could see fury building in his eyes, directed not at me but at the people who had apparently intercepted this gift and hidden it from me. I gave your father specific instructions, he said, his voice tight with controlled rage. I explained that I was doing this because I wanted you to have stability and independence, because I trusted you to manage property responsibly, because you deserve something that was truly yours without conditions or strings. I told him explicitly that I did not want this turned into some kind of leverage or manipulation. He looked me in the eye and assured me he understood, that he and your mother would help you navigate the practical aspects without interfering in your choices about how to use the property. I sat there, frozen, as the implications cascaded through my understanding. My parents had known for 8 months that my grandfather had given me a house. They had the keys. They had the deed. They had all the documentation. And they had said nothing, done nothing, allowed me to continue living in my small rented apartment and paying rent every month while a house that was legally mine sat empty and this thought made my stomach turn, was being used by them in some way I did not yet understand. Have you been paying property taxes on it? I asked, a new concern emerging. If it is in my name, am I responsible for taxes? Have I been accumulating unpaid tax bills without knowing it? No, he said quickly, understanding my alarm. I set up the account I mentioned specifically to handle those obligations. The taxes are paid automatically from that account. You have not been delinquent on anything. But the fact that you did not know about the account or the property or any of this. He trailed off, shaking his head slowly. We sat in silence for a long moment, both of us trying to process what this meant. My grandfather looked older suddenly, tired and disappointed in a way that made my heart ache. He had done something generous and thoughtful, had tried to give me something valuable in multiple senses of the word, and the gift had been intercepted and hidden by his own son and daughter-in-law. What do you want to do? He finally asked. This is your property, your situation to handle however you think is right. But I need you to know that I am furious about this deception, and I intend to address it with your parents directly. I took a shaky breath, trying to organize my thoughts into something coherent. I need to understand what actually happened before I decide anything. Maybe there is some explanation we are not seeing. Maybe they had a reason for not telling me right away and then time passed and it became awkward to bring up. Maybe they thought they were protecting me from feeling overwhelmed by sudden responsibility. Even as I said these words, trying to give my parents the benefit of doubt, I knew they sounded hollow. There was no innocent explanation for hiding something this significant for 8 months. This was not an oversight or a well-intentioned mistake. This was deliberate concealment and I needed to understand why. Grandpa William reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folder. These are copies of all the documentation. The deed showing your name as the property owner. The account information for the maintenance fund. The address and access information. I am giving this to you directly now, the way I should have done in the first place instead of trusting intermediaries. I took the folder with trembling hands, opening it to see official documents with my name printed clearly as the owner of a property at an address I had never visited. The reality of it was starting to sink in beneath the shock and confusion. I owned a house. I had owned a house for 8 months without knowing it. My parents had known and had told me nothing. There is something else you need to know, Grandpa William said, his voice becoming even more serious. When I gave your parents the keys and documents, I also gave them a letter for you. I wrote you a detailed explanation of why I was doing this, what the property meant to me, and what I hoped it might mean for your future. Your father said he would make sure you received it along with everything else. Obviously, you did not get that letter either. The thought of a personal letter from my grandfather, something he had taken time to write specifically for me, being hidden away somewhere was almost more upsetting than the concealed property itself. That letter would have contained his thoughts and feelings, his reasons and hopes, things that could not be replaced or reconstructed even if the practical information could be recovered. I want to see the house, I said, making a decision. Right now if possible. I need to see what we are actually talking about, and I need to understand what is going on before I confront my parents about why they hid this from me. Grandpa William nodded, approval showing in his expression. That is a sensible approach. Let me pay the check and we can drive up there together. I have not been to the property since we closed on it in April, but I have the current access codes and I can show you around. 20 minutes later, we were in his car, driving north toward Lake Oswego, an affluent suburb known for beautiful properties and high property values. I sat in the passenger seat, the folder of documents in my lap, trying to prepare myself for whatever we were about to discover. Part of me was excited to see this house that had been mine for 8 months without my knowledge. Part of me was dreading what we might find, what evidence there might be of my parents' deception and their reasons for it. The drive took about 35 minutes through late morning traffic. Grandpa William drove carefully, staying in the right lane, following speed limits precisely, habits from a lifetime of being responsible and rule-following even in small things. We did not talk much during the drive. There was too much to process, too many questions without answers yet. When we finally turned onto a quiet residential street lined with mature trees and well-maintained properties, I felt my breath catch. These were not modest starter homes. These were substantial properties with lake access, the kind of houses that people in my income bracket did not typically own, the kind of neighborhood where I would never have imagined living. We pulled into a driveway that curved slightly, leading to a charming 2-story house with cedar shingle siding weathered to a soft gray, large windows facing what must be the lakeside, and a small but well-maintained yard. This is it, Grandpa William said softly. Your house. I got out of the car slowly, taking in details. The property looked well-maintained, not abandoned or neglected. The lawn was mowed, the shrubs were trimmed, the walkway was swept clean of leaves and debris. Someone had been taking care of this place, which raised immediate questions about who and why. As we approached the front door, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There was a doormat that had not been there when the house was purchased, Grandpa William confirmed. It was a decorative mat with a cheerful greeting, the kind of thing someone puts down when they are using a property regularly. And next to the door, there was a small table with a ceramic pot containing healthy, well-watered flowers. Grandpa William punched in the access code for the electronic lock, and the door opened with a soft click. We stepped inside, and what I saw made the betrayal suddenly devastatingly clear. The house was furnished. Not just furnished but decorated and clearly being lived in. There was mail stacked neatly on the entry table, magazines on the coffee table in the living room, personal items on shelves, photographs on walls. And the photographs, when I looked closer, were of my parents. This was not an empty property waiting for me to claim it. This was a house my parents had been using as what appeared to be a weekend retreat, a lake house for their own enjoyment, all while I paid rent on my small apartment and had no idea that I actually owned this beautiful property. The full weight of the betrayal hit me then, taking my breath away. They had not just hidden this gift from me. They had stolen it, effectively, using property that was legally mine for their own purposes while letting me believe I had nothing. The calculated nature of it, the months of deception, the ease with which they had apparently lied to both my grandfather and to me, all of it crashed over me at once. Grandpa William stood beside me, his face a mask of barely contained fury as he took in the same details I was seeing. I am so sorry, he said quietly. I trusted them. I believed they would do the right thing. I failed you by not following up directly, by not making sure you had received everything as intended. I turned to look at him, this man who had tried to give me something valuable and meaningful, whose generosity had been intercepted and perverted by his own son. This is not your fault, I said firmly, even though my voice was shaking. You did something kind and thoughtful. You trusted your family to be decent. That is not a failure. What they did, this is not on you. We walked through the house together, documenting everything with photos on our phones. The master bedroom clearly set up as my parents' space, with my mother's preferred style of decor, and my father's reading materials on the nightstand. The second bedroom converted into an office with my father's desk and computer equipment. The kitchen stocked with food and their preferred brands of coffee and wine. The closets containing their clothing and recreational equipment. The garage housing what appeared to be a small boat for lake activities. They had created an entire secondary residence in my house, had been enjoying weekends and probably longer stays at the lake, had been living a lifestyle that they were funding with their own resources but conducting in a space that belonged to me, that had been given to me as a gift meant to provide security and independence. By the time we finished walking through the property, I felt numb with shock and anger. This was not a simple oversight or a well-intentioned mistake that had spiraled out of control. This was calculated, sustained deception. For 8 months they had been actively hiding this property from me, using it for themselves and presumably planning to continue doing so indefinitely. "What do you want to do?" Grandpa William asked again, the same question he had posed at the cafe but now waited with so much more understanding of what we were actually dealing with. I looked around the living room one more time, at the comfortable furniture and the pleasant view of the lake through the large windows, at the life my parents had been living in my house without my knowledge or permission. I thought about all the times over the past 8 months when I had worried about money, when I had carefully budgeted to make rent payments, when I had postponed purchases or experiences because I needed to be financially responsible. I thought about my parents during those same months, expressing concern about my financial situation, while secretly enjoying weekends at a lake house that was legally mine. "I want to confront them," I said, my voice steadier now as anger began to replace shock. "I want to hear what explanation they could possibly offer for this. And then I want to decide what happens next based on whether they can be honest about what they have done and why." Grandpa William nodded slowly. "I will be there with you if you want support. Or I can step back if you would prefer to handle this yourself. But either way, I want you to know that I support whatever decision you make about how to address this situation and what relationship you want to have with them going forward." The drive back to Portland felt longer than the drive out had been, even though we hit less traffic. I spent the time looking through the folder of documents, reading the deed that listed me as the property owner, reviewing the account statements showing that my grandfather had been funding property taxes and maintenance as promised. Everything was exactly as he had described it. He had done everything correctly, generously, thoughtfully. My parents had intercepted all of it and perverted it into something entirely different. When we finally pulled up in front of my apartment building, I sat for a moment before getting out of the car, gathering my courage for what came next. "I am going to call them and ask them to meet me this evening," I said. "I think it needs to happen today, before I lose my nerve or before they have time to construct elaborate explanations." "Whatever you need," Grandpa William said. "I am proud of you for how you are handling this, even though I know it is incredibly painful." I got out of the car, clutching the folder to my chest like armor, and watched my grandfather drive away. Then I went up to my apartment, sat down on my second-hand couch in my small living room, and made the phone call that would change everything about my relationship with my parents and my understanding of who they actually were beneath the performance of family love. The phone call to my parents was brief and carefully controlled. I kept my voice neutral, gave no indication of what I had discovered, simply said that something important had come up and I needed to speak with them this evening if possible. My mother's response had that particular quality of mild annoyance that she reserved for requests that inconvenienced her social schedule, but she agreed after checking with my father. They would meet me at 6 o'clock at their house in the West Hills, one of Portland's most prestigious neighborhoods where they had lived for the past 12 years, in a home that projected exactly the image of success and refinement they valued. I spent the hours between that phone call and the evening meeting in a strange state of suspended emotion. Part of me wanted to rage, to call them back and demand immediate answers, to force confrontation before they had time to prepare defenses. Another part of me felt numb and detached, as if this were happening to someone else and I was merely observing from a distance. I cleaned my apartment with methodical focus, organizing things that did not need organizing, creating order in my physical space because my emotional and mental space felt chaotic and unmanageable. Around 4 in the afternoon my phone rang. It was my best friend Maya-chan, who had known me since college and who understood my family dynamics better than almost anyone. We had plans to meet for dinner later in the week, but she was calling to confirm details. "Hey, are we still on for Thursday?" she asked cheerfully. "I found this new Vietnamese place in Southeast that supposedly has the best pho in the city." "Maya, I need to tell you something," I said, and then the whole story spilled out. The cafe conversation with my grandfather, the drive to Lake Oswego, the furnished house that my parents had been using as their private retreat, the 8 months of deception. Maya listened without interrupting, which was one of her greatest qualities as a friend. She knew when to offer commentary and when to simply witness. When I finished, there was a long pause before she spoke. "Natalie, I know you want to give them a chance to explain, and I understand that impulse. But I need you to prepare yourself for the possibility that there is no explanation that will make this okay. What they did is not a mistake or a miscommunication. This is sustained, calculated deception. They made active choices every single day for 8 months to continue lying to you." "I know," I said quietly. "But I need to hear what they say. I need to give them the opportunity to be honest, even though I already know they probably will not be." "Do you want me to come with you?" Maya offered. "Not to the actual conversation, but I could wait in the car or at a coffee shop nearby. Just so you have support close if you need it." I considered the offer, tempted by the idea of having someone in my corner, but ultimately decided this needed to be handled without outside witnesses. "Thank you, but I think I need to do this alone. Or with my grandfather since he is directly involved. But I will call you afterward, regardless of how it goes." "Promise." "Promise." At 5:30, I gathered the folder of documents, checked my appearance in the mirror to ensure I looked composed and in control, and drove to my parents' house. The route was familiar, though I typically only made this drive for obligatory holidays and occasional family dinners that felt more like performances than genuine gatherings. The house itself was impressive in the way that expensive houses in expensive neighborhoods tend to be. All clean lines and tasteful landscaping and subtle displays of wealth that suggested success without seeming ostentatious. I parked on the street rather than in their circular driveway, wanting to maintain the option for quick departure if the conversation became unbearable. My grandfather's car was already there, parked near the entrance. We had agreed he would arrive first and be present for the confrontation, both as a witness and as a reminder that this deception had impacted him as well, had betrayed his trust and generosity just as much as it had hurt me. I walked up the stone pathway to their front door, rang the doorbell even though I technically had a key, and waited. My mother answered, dressed in casual elegance that probably cost more than my monthly salary, her expression pleasant but with an edge of curiosity about why this meeting had been necessary. "Natalie, come in. Your father and grandfather are in the living room. Can I get you something to drink?" "No, thank you," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I just need to talk to both of you about something important." We walked through the foyer with its vaulted ceiling and carefully curated art into the living room where my father sat in his preferred armchair and my grandfather occupied the sofa, his posture rigid with controlled anger. My father looked relaxed, clearly not anticipating any serious conflict. My mother settled into the chair opposite my father, crossing her legs and arranging herself in that studied casual pose that suggested she was comfortable and in control of her environment. I remained standing, the folder held against my chest, and looked at both of my parents directly. This morning Grandpa took me to breakfast and asked me how I liked the lake house he bought for me last April. I told him I had no idea what he was talking about because I have never heard anything about a lake house or any property being purchased in my name. The change in my parents' expressions was immediate and revealing. My mother's face went carefully blank, the social mask she wore when confronted with something uncomfortable. My father's eyes narrowed slightly, and I saw him glance quickly at my grandfather before returning his attention to me. Neither of them spoke, which was itself telling. Innocent people confronted with such a statement would have expressed confusion or surprise. Their silence indicated they knew exactly what I was talking about, and were calculating how to respond. "After learning that this property existed and that you had been given all the documentation and keys 8 months ago with explicit instructions to help me understand what Grandpa had done for me, we drove to Lake Oswego to see the house. Would you like to know what we found?" My mother finally spoke, her voice carefully modulated. "Natalie, I think there may have been some miscommunication about the situation. We were planning to discuss this with you when the timing was appropriate." The timing was appropriate 8 months ago when you first received the deed and the keys, I said, my voice harder now. But let me tell you what we found today, and then you can explain what possible timing considerations justified 8 months of deception. I opened the folder and pulled out several of the photos I had taken on my phone and printed during the afternoon. Photos of the furnished house, of the personal items clearly belonging to my parents, of the master bedroom set up as their private retreat, of the kitchen stocked with their preferred brands, of the garage containing their recreational equipment. We found that you have been using my house as your personal lake property. Not just visiting occasionally, but fully inhabiting it, furnishing it with your things, treating it as your own weekend retreat while I continued paying rent on my apartment with no idea that I owned a house that was sitting empty. Except it was not sitting empty, was it? You were enjoying it while I was completely unaware of its existence. My father shifted in his chair, his relaxed posture disappearing. Now, let us not be overly dramatic about this. The situation is more complex than you are making it sound. Then please explain the complexity, I said, still standing, still holding the folder like a shield. I am genuinely interested in hearing what complex factors required you to hide my property from me for 8 months while using it yourselves. My grandfather spoke for the first time since I had arrived, his voice cold and precise. Richard, I gave you explicit instructions. I explained that this property was for Natalie, that it was meant to provide her with security and independence, and that your role was simply to help her understand the practical aspects of ownership. I trusted you to handle this responsibility with integrity. Instead, you stole from your own daughter. We did not steal anything, my mother interjected, her composure cracking slightly. The property is still in her name. We did not change ownership or take anything from her legally. You took 8 months of use, I said. You took the opportunity for me to live there rent-free or to rent it out for income. You took my ability to make decisions about my own property. You took my grandfather's generosity and perverted it into something entirely different from what he intended. That is theft, even if the deed still has my name on it. My father stood up, using his height advantage to try to regain control of the situation. You need to understand the context here. When your grandfather told us he had purchased this property for you, we had serious concerns about whether you were prepared to handle that responsibility. You are barely managing your current finances. We questioned whether adding property ownership with all its complications was wise at this stage of your life. So your solution was to hide it from me completely and use it yourselves? I asked, incredulity bleeding into my anger. If you had concerns about my readiness, the appropriate response would have been to discuss those concerns with me and with Grandpa, not to intercept the gift entirely and treat my property as your own. We were protecting you, my mother said, her voice taking on that particular tone of injured reasonableness that she used when defending indefensible positions. We know how you are with responsibility. You get overwhelmed. You struggle with decision-making. We thought it would be better to quietly manage the property until you were in a better position to handle it. The condescension in her words, the casual dismissal of my competence, crystallized something that had been forming in my understanding throughout this confrontation. This was not really about the house. The house was simply the most concrete manifestation of a much deeper pattern. My parents had spent years undermining my confidence and autonomy, treating me as perpetually insufficient and in need of their management, all while positioning themselves as protective and concerned rather than controlling and dismissive. I am a 28-year-old professional with a college degree and a stable career, I said, my voice shaking now with emotion I was struggling to contain. I manage a classroom of 30 students. I handle complex social dynamics and educational challenges every single day. I pay my bills, maintain my apartment, navigate adult life successfully. The fact that my choices do not match your preferences does not mean I am incompetent or overwhelmed. You chose to be a teacher, my father said, and the disdain in his voice was no longer concealed. You chose a profession that pays poorly and offers limited advancement. You live in a small apartment in an unfashionable neighborhood. You drive an old car. You dress like a graduate student. These are not the choices of someone who has their life together. The mask was coming off now, the performance of parental concern giving way to revealed contempt. I felt my grandfather tense beside me, and I could sense he was restraining himself from intervening, allowing me to handle this confrontation in my own way. So because my life does not look like the life you wanted for me, you decided I was not competent to own property that was gifted to me? And your protection involved using that property for your own enjoyment while letting me believe I had nothing? We were going to tell you eventually, my mother said, but her voice lacked conviction now. We were planning to transition it to you. Once you demonstrated more financial stability. When would that have been? I asked. What specific milestone was I supposed to reach before you deemed me worthy of knowing about my own property? And while we are asking questions, where is the letter that Grandpa wrote to me explaining his reasons for this gift? He gave that to you along with everything else. Where is it? The silence that followed my question was absolute and damning. My mother looked at my father. My father looked away, out the window, anywhere but at me or at my grandfather. You did not keep it, did you? I said, understanding flooding through me. You destroyed it. Because that letter would have contained information you did not want me to have, explanations and intentions that would have made it impossible for you to justify what you were doing. It is gone, my father finally admitted. We felt the content was not appropriate given the circumstances. My grandfather stood up abruptly. His face flushed with anger I had never seen him display before. You destroyed a personal letter I wrote to my granddaughter because you decided its content was not appropriate? You appointed yourselves censors of communication between me and her? What gave you the right to make that choice? We are her parents, my mother said, her voice rising defensively. We have the right to make decisions about what is best for her. She is 28 years old, I said, my own voice louder now. You have no such right. You have not had that right for a decade. The fact that you believe you do reveals exactly what this is really about. This is not protection. This is control. You want to manage my life according to your vision because my actual choices threaten your narrative about yourselves and your parenting. That is not fair, my mother said, and I could hear genuine hurt in her voice now, though whether it was hurt at being confronted or hurt at having her self-image challenged I could not tell. We have always wanted what is best for you. No, I said, and the clarity of this truth felt both liberating and devastating. You have always wanted what looks best for you. You wanted a daughter whose life you could discuss proudly at the country club. You wanted achievements you could claim partial credit for. You wanted me to reflect well on your parenting and your status. But you never actually wanted me to be independent or autonomous because that would mean losing control over how my life serves your narrative. The room fell into heavy silence. My father had sat back down. His expression closed and defensive. My mother was blinking rapidly, fighting tears that I suspected were more about her own discomfort than about genuine remorse. My grandfather remained standing, his presence a solid reminder that I was not alone in this confrontation, that someone saw clearly what was happening and supported my right to name it honestly. What do you want from us? My father finally asked, his voice tight. What is the point of this confrontation? To make us feel guilty? To punish us for trying to help you? I want honesty, I said. I want you to stop pretending this was about protection or help. I want you to acknowledge that you lied to me and to Grandpa for 8 months because you felt entitled to make decisions about my property and my life without my knowledge or consent. I want you to admit that you destroyed a letter meant for me because it contained things you did not want me to know. I want you to recognize that what you did was wrong, not complicated or well-intentioned, but simply wrong. And if we do that, my mother asked, if we apologize and admit we made mistakes, what then? Do we just pretend this never happened and go back to normal? I do not know what happens then, I said honestly, but I know that without honesty and accountability, there is no foundation for any relationship, let alone a healthy one. Right now, I am not sure what kind of relationship we can have going forward because I am not sure I can trust anything you tell me. My father stood up again, his face hardening into an expression of stubborn pride. If you want to be dramatic and treat this like some enormous betrayal instead of a complex family situation, that is your choice. But do not expect us to grovel and beg forgiveness for trying to protect you from your own impracticality. The dismissiveness in his tone, the absolute refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing or show genuine remorse, clarified everything. They were not going to admit what they had done. They were not going to apologize meaningfully. They were going to continue positioning themselves as the reasonable adults managing an impractical child, regardless of evidence or reality. Then I think we are done here, I said, closing the folder. The property is legally mine. I will be taking possession of it immediately. I will be changing the locks and the access codes. You will remove all of your belongings within the next week, or I will treat them as abandoned property and dispose of them as I see fit. You will not contact me unless I initiate contact. I need time and space to process what you have done and to decide what kind of relationship, if any, I want to have with you going forward. You are being ridiculous, my mother said. But there was panic in her voice now, the realization that I was serious about establishing boundaries and consequences. We are your parents. You cannot just cut us out of your life over a misunderstanding about a house. This is not a misunderstanding, I said firmly. This is a deliberate, sustained betrayal of trust. And yes, I can establish boundaries with anyone, including parents who have demonstrated they do not respect my autonomy or basic honesty. You have spent years undermining my confidence and dismissing my choices. You have treated me as an extension of yourselves rather than as a separate person with my own valid path. And when given the opportunity to demonstrate respect and integrity, you chose deception and theft instead. Those are choices with consequences. I turned to my grandfather, who had been watching this entire exchange with an expression of profound sadness and disappointment. Grandpa, are you ready to go? He nodded, reaching out to squeeze my shoulder in silent support. We walked together toward the front door, leaving my parents standing in their carefully decorated living room, the performance of family harmony completely shattered. As we reached the door, my mother called out one more time. Natalie, please. Can we at least talk about this reasonably? We can work something out. I turned back to look at her, this woman who had raised me and who I had loved my entire life, who I now saw clearly for perhaps the first time. When you are ready to be honest about what you did and why you did it, when you are ready to treat me as an autonomous adult rather than as a possession or reflection of yourselves, then maybe we can talk. But I will not negotiate with people who are still pretending they did nothing wrong. We left the house, walking down the stone pathway to our cars in the fading evening light. The summer air was warm and still, carrying the scent of blooming roses from my parents' carefully maintained garden. Everything looked peaceful and beautiful and normal, which felt grotesquely at odds with the rupture that had just occurred. At my car, my grandfather pulled me into a hug that I desperately needed. I am so sorry, he said again. I am sorry I did not check in directly with you months ago. I am sorry I trusted them to do the right thing when I should have known better. You are not responsible for their choices, I said, my voice muffled against his shoulder. You did something generous and thoughtful. They corrupted it. That is on them, not on you. We stood there for a long moment, and I allowed myself to lean into his solid, steady presence, to draw strength from the one family member who had consistently seen me and valued me for who I actually was rather than who he wanted me to be. When we finally stepped apart, he looked at me with a mixture of pride and concern. What are you going to do now? Do you want to stay at my place tonight? I do not like the idea of you being alone after that confrontation. I considered the offer but shook my head. I need to go home and process this in my own space. But thank you. For everything. For the gift, for supporting me today, for believing I was capable of handling this property even when your own son did not. You are capable of handling far more than any of them give you credit for, he said firmly. I have always known that. It is one of the reasons I wanted to give you the security of property ownership. Not because I thought you needed rescue, but because I thought you deserved a foundation to build from. We said goodbye, and I drove back to my apartment through streets that looked exactly the same as they had that morning, but that felt completely transformed. I had woken up that day as someone who had a complicated but basically functional relationship with her parents. I was going to bed as someone who had discovered that relationship had been built on performance and manipulation, rather than genuine care and respect. Back in my apartment, I finally allowed myself to cry, releasing the emotions I had been containing throughout the confrontation. Anger at the betrayal, grief at the loss of the family relationship I had believed existed, fear about what came next, relief at having finally spoken truth clearly instead of accepting comfortable lies. All of it poured out in waves that left me exhausted and emptied. Around 9 in the evening I called Maya as promised. She answered immediately, clearly having been waiting for my call. How bad was it? She asked without preamble. Worse than I anticipated, I said. They are not sorry. They do not think they did anything wrong. They are positioning this as me being dramatic and ungrateful rather than acknowledging any responsibility for lying and using my property without permission. What are you going to do? I am going to take possession of my house. I am going to establish clear boundaries with my parents. I am going to figure out my life without their interference or manipulation. I am going to trust myself instead of constantly second-guessing my choices because they have spent years telling me I am not competent. That sounds healthy and terrifying, Maya said gently. It is both, I admitted. But it also feels necessary. I think I have been living in a fog of their judgment and control for so long that I forgot what it felt like to trust my own perspective. Today was awful, but it was also clarifying. I can see things now that I could not see before, patterns that I was too close to recognize. We talked for another hour, with Maya offering the kind of unconditional support that true friendship provides. She did not try to minimize what had happened or rush me toward forgiveness. She simply witnessed my experience and validated my right to feel everything I was feeling without judgment or pressure to handle it any particular way. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my apartment and thought about the lake house that was legally mine but that I had never chosen, never seen until today, never had the opportunity to make into something that reflected my actual needs and preferences. My parents had furnished it according to their tastes, had used it for their purposes, had treated it as an extension of themselves rather than as something that belonged to me. Over the next week I would need to reclaim that space, to transform it from their weekend retreat into something that was genuinely mine. But more than that, I would need to reclaim my own life, my own sense of competence and direction, my own right to make choices that served my values rather than their image. It was going to be difficult and painful, and probably more complicated than I could yet imagine. But for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt like I was moving toward something authentic, rather than performing a role in someone else's vision of how my life should look. And that clarity, hard-won and costly as it was, felt like the beginning of genuine freedom. The morning after the confrontation arrived with an uncomfortable clarity that made sleep feel like a distant memory. I had spent most of the night alternating between restless attempts at rest and periods of staring at the ceiling, replaying conversations and processing revelations that seemed to multiply rather than simplify as I examined them. By the time pale light began filtering through my apartment windows, I had made several decisions that felt both terrifying and absolutely necessary. The first decision was practical and immediate. I would go to the lake house that day and begin the process of taking actual possession of the property that had been legally mine for 8 months without my knowledge. This was not simply about asserting ownership or punishing my parents by removing their access to a space they had been enjoying. It was about confronting the physical reality of what had been done, about standing in that space and understanding concretely what 8 months of deception actually looked like when translated into furniture and personal belongings and carefully curated decorative choices. The second decision was more complex and would require sustained effort over time. I needed to examine my entire relationship with my parents and understand how deeply their patterns of control and dismissal had shaped my understanding of myself and my capabilities. The lake house situation was not an isolated incident. It was the most dramatic and undeniable manifestation of dynamics that had been operating for years, dynamics that I had normalized and accommodated without recognizing them as problematic. The third decision was perhaps the most difficult. I needed to learn how to trust my own judgment and perceptions without constantly filtering them through the question of whether my parents would approve, or whether my choices measured up to their standards. This would require conscious, deliberate practice because the habit of seeking their validation or bracing for their criticism had become so deeply ingrained that it operated almost automatically. I made coffee and toast, forcing myself to eat even though anxiety had largely eliminated my appetite. While I ate, I composed a formal email to my parents that would serve as official documentation of my requirements regarding the lake house property. The tone was carefully neutral and businesslike, free of emotion or accusation, simply stating facts and expectations. The email informed them that I would be taking possession of the property immediately, that they had 7 days to remove all personal belongings, that I would be changing locks and access codes by the end of the week, and that any items remaining after the 7-day period would be considered abandoned and disposed of accordingly. I included the property address and access information, making clear that I expected coordination of their removal efforts to occur through email rather than phone calls or in-person meetings. I copied my grandfather on the email as a witness and sent it before I could second-guess the wording or soften the boundaries I was establishing. The response came within 30 minutes, which told me my parents had been awake and probably anticipating communication. My mother had written it, her tone managing to convey wounded dignity and subtle reproach while technically complying with my request for email communication. She wrote that they would retrieve their belongings as requested, that they hoped I would reconsider my harsh reaction once I had time to calm down and think more clearly, and that they remained available whenever I was ready to discuss this situation rationally. The implicit message was clear. I was being emotional and irrational. They were being patient and reasonable. When I came to my senses and recognized that I was overreacting, they would graciously forgive my dramatics and we could return to normal patterns. The fact that normal patterns included them making unilateral decisions about my property and my life without my knowledge apparently did not factor into their definition of rational discussion. I did not respond to the email. There was nothing productive to say, and engaging with their framing would only reinforce the dynamic they were trying to maintain. Instead, I gathered my things, collected the folder of property documents, and drove back to Lake Oswego to spend time in the house that was mine and to begin understanding what reclaiming it would actually require. The drive gave me time to think about practical matters. The house was fully furnished with my parents' belongings, which meant I would need to make decisions about what to do with the space once they removed everything. I could furnish it myself gradually as finances allowed, or I could sell it and use the proceeds for something more aligned with my actual needs and preferences. I could live in it myself, which would eliminate rent payments and provide significantly more space than my current apartment. I could rent it out and generate income while maintaining my current living situation. All of these options were now available to me, which was both liberating and overwhelming. When I arrived at the property, I sat in my car for several minutes before going inside, looking at the house with different eyes than I had the previous day. Yesterday it had been a crime scene of sorts, evidence of betrayal that needed to be documented and understood. Today it was simply a house, a physical structure with potential that had not yet been defined. What it would become depended entirely on choices I would make rather than choices made for me or despite me. I used my key and the access code to enter, and the space felt different without my grandfather beside me and without the immediate shock of discovery. The furniture was still there, the personal items still in place, but they seemed less significant now. These were just objects that would be removed. The space itself, the structure and the location and the potential, remained unchanged by whatever temporary use my parents had made of it. I walked through each room slowly, this time not documenting evidence but instead imagining possibilities. The master bedroom where my parents had set up their retreat could become my own bedroom, though I would want to completely change the decor to reflect my preferences rather than theirs. The second bedroom office could be converted into an art studio, a dedicated space for creative work that I had never had room for in my small apartment. The kitchen was well designed and functional, and I found myself imagining cooking meals there, hosting friends for dinner, creating the kind of warm and authentic home environment that my parents' formal entertaining had never achieved. The living room had large windows facing the lake, and I stood looking out at the water for a long time, watching light play across the surface and thinking about how different this view would feel if I were seeing it as the resident of this space rather than as an intruder in my own property. There was a small deck accessible through sliding glass doors, and I stepped outside into the morning air, feeling the particular quality of light and temperature that marked this microclimate near the water. This could be mine. Not in the abstract legal sense of having my name on a deed, but in the real sense of choosing it and making it into something that reflected my actual life and values. That possibility felt both exciting and daunting. I had spent so long living small, keeping my footprint minimal, avoiding commitment to anything that felt too permanent or too ambitious. Partly this had been financial necessity, but I was beginning to recognize that it had also been psychological protection. If I never claimed space or resources or stability, if I kept everything provisional and temporary, then I could not be accused of presuming too much or reaching beyond my appropriate station. My parents had taught me that lesson through years of subtle and not so subtle messages about my choices being insufficient or impractical. They had communicated clearly that the life I was building did not measure up to their standards, and I had internalized that judgment to the point where I stopped imagining alternatives. I had accepted that I would always live small, would always struggle financially, would always need to defer dreams and desires because they were not realistic for someone with my income and prospects. But my grandfather had seen something different. He had looked at my life and seen someone who deserved security and possibility, rather than someone who needed to be managed or corrected. He had trusted me with significant property not because he thought I was perfect or had achieved some particular milestone, but simply because he believed I would handle it responsibly, and that having it would improve my life in meaningful ways. That trust felt both precious and heavy, a gift that carried the weight of high expectations even as it offered new freedom. I spent several hours at the house that morning taking measurements and making notes, beginning to develop a concrete sense of what would be involved in actually living there. The property taxes and basic maintenance were covered for 5 years through the account my grandfather had established, which removed the most significant financial barrier. Utilities would be manageable, probably comparable to what I currently paid for my much smaller apartment. The commute to my school would be longer but not unreasonable, perhaps 45 minutes in typical traffic. The more I considered the practical aspects, the more feasible it seemed. I could give notice on my apartment, which would eliminate that monthly rent payment. I could move my existing furniture, which would provide basics while I gradually acquired additional pieces as needed. I could invite friends to visit in ways that had never been possible in my small apartment where having more than 2 guests felt crowded. I could create space for art projects that currently had to be abandoned or completed in corners because I lacked dedicated studio space. Most importantly, I could demonstrate to myself and to my parents that I was fully capable of managing property ownership and all its responsibilities. Their stated concern had been that I was not prepared for this level of responsibility, though their actual behavior suggested their real concern was losing control over my choices and my dependence on their approval. Either way, successfully inhabiting this space and managing it well would provide clear evidence that their assessment of my capabilities had been wrong. Around noon, I locked up the house and drove to a nearby cafe to get lunch and continue thinking through logistics. While I ate, I made lists of what would need to happen to facilitate a move. Notice to my current landlord with appropriate timing. Arrangements for moving my belongings, probably with help from friends since I did not own enough to justify hiring professional movers. Utilities to be transferred or established in my name. Address changes for various accounts and services. The list was long but manageable. Nothing that exceeded normal adult capability to coordinate and execute. My phone rang while I was working through these logistics. It was my grandfather calling to check on how I was doing after the previous evening's confrontation. I am at the lake house, I told him. Or rather, I was there this morning and now I am at a cafe nearby, thinking through what it would take to actually move in and live there. There was a pause before he responded, and I could hear both surprise and approval in his voice when he spoke. You are thinking about living there yourself rather than selling it or renting it out? I think so. The more time I spend here, the more it feels like something I could make into a real home, rather than just an asset to be managed. Is that what you were hoping when you bought it? That I would actually live in it? I was hoping you would have choices, he said carefully. Living there was one possibility, but so was renting it for income or selling it if you preferred something different. The point was giving you options and security, not dictating any particular path. But I will admit that imagining you living there, having space to create and grow, building something stable and permanent, that possibility pleased me very much. We talked for another 20 minutes, with him offering practical advice based on his decades of property ownership and management experience. He suggested contractors for any repairs or modifications I might want to make, warned me about common issues with lakefront properties and how to address them preventively, and reminded me that he was available to help with any aspect of the transition that felt overwhelming or confusing. Before we hung up, he said something that struck me with unexpected force. Natalie, I want you to know that watching you handle this situation with such clarity and strength has been remarkable. I know your parents spent years undermining your confidence, and I regret that I did not recognize or challenge that pattern more directly. But the way you confronted them yesterday, the way you are taking control of this situation now, it shows the person you actually are beneath all the doubt they tried to instill. I am very proud of you, and I am excited to see what you build in this next chapter. After the call ended, I sat with those words for a long time, feeling something shift in my understanding of myself. My grandfather saw capability where my parents saw inadequacy, He saw strength where they saw weakness requiring their management. He saw potential where they saw limitation requiring their correction. Both perspectives could not be simultaneously accurate, which meant I had to choose which assessment to believe and internalize. For most of my adult life, I had defaulted to believing my parents' assessment because they were my parents and because their criticism came wrapped in expressed concern for my well-being. But their concern had never actually translated into support for my actual choices and directions. They had never asked what would help me succeed in the path I had chosen. They had only pressured me to abandon that path in favor of something they considered more appropriate. My grandfather, by contrast, had consistently supported my actual choices, while offering resources and wisdom that helped me succeed in the direction I had set for myself. He had never tried to change my mind about teaching or pressured me toward more lucrative or prestigious careers. He had simply asked how teaching was going, what challenges I was facing, what successes I was experiencing, and whether there were ways he could support my effectiveness in that role. The difference was profound and clarifying. One approach treated me as fundamentally misguided and in need of correction. The other treated me as fundamentally sound in my judgment and worthy of support. One approach required me to become someone different before I could be accepted. The other accepted me as I was while offering resources to help me become more fully myself. I finished my lunch and spent the afternoon driving around the Lake Oswego area, familiarizing myself with the neighborhood and community that would become my home if I followed through with the move I was contemplating. I located the nearest grocery store, the library, the post office, the various services and amenities that constituted daily life infrastructure. I drove the route from the house to my school several times, learning the traffic patterns and identifying the most efficient path. Everything felt simultaneously foreign and accessible. This was not my current neighborhood with its familiar landmarks and rhythms, but it could become familiar. I could learn these streets and establish new routines and build community connections in this new location. The strangeness was temporary. The possibility was permanent. By early evening, I had returned to my apartment with a decision made. I would move into the lake house. I would give notice on my apartment lease. I would transition my life to this new space that offered so much more room for growth and creativity and stability than I had allowed myself to imagine having. This decision felt enormous and slightly terrifying, but it also felt deeply right in a way that bypassed rational analysis and connected to some more fundamental sense of alignment and possibility. Over the next week, I moved through logistics with focused determination that surprised me. I gave notice to my landlord, explaining that I was moving to a house I had recently acquired. I contacted utility companies to arrange service transfers. I recruited Maya and several other friends to help with the actual moving process, offering pizza and gratitude in exchange for their labor and vehicle space. My parents sent 2 more emails during that week, each one attempting to reframe the situation or negotiate modifications to the boundaries I had established. I responded to neither message, maintaining the clear separation I had articulated. They could remove their belongings during the week I had specified, but I would not engage in discussions about whether my response was proportionate or whether I was being unreasonable. On the 5th day after the confrontation, I received an email from my mother stating that they had retrieved all their belongings from the house and that I was welcome to inspect the property to confirm nothing remained. The tone was coldly polite, stripped of the wounded dignity that had characterized earlier messages. They had apparently recognized that I was not going to soften or accommodate their preferred narrative, and they were adjusting their approach accordingly. I drove to the lake house that evening to verify that they had indeed removed everything. The house was empty now, completely cleared of furniture and personal items. They had been thorough and, I had to acknowledge, respectful of the property itself. Nothing was damaged or left in poor condition. They had simply taken everything that was theirs and left the space clean and vacant. Walking through the empty rooms felt strange and symbolic. This was truly a blank canvas now, undefined by anyone else's choices or preferences. What it became would be entirely up to me. That freedom was exhilarating and intimidating in equal measure. I had so little practice making choices based purely on my own preferences without filtering them through anticipated judgment or criticism. I stood in what would become my bedroom and thought about what kind of space I wanted to create there. Not what would look impressive or what would meet some external standard of appropriate adult taste, but what would actually feel comfortable and nurturing and authentically mine. I thought about colors I loved that I had never used because they seemed too bold or too unconventional. I thought about the art I would hang, the books I would keep nearby, the small personal touches that would make this space reflect my actual personality rather than some performed version of acceptable maturity. The next day, Maya came with me to the house to help me think through furniture placement and design possibilities. She walked through each room with the eye of someone who understood both aesthetics and function, offering suggestions that honored my preferences while providing practical guidance I genuinely needed. "This is amazing, Natalie," she said as we stood on the deck looking at the lake. "Not just the property itself, though obviously that is incredible, but watching you step into this possibility, watching you make decisions based on what you actually want rather than what you think you should want, it is like seeing you become more fully yourself." "It feels terrifying," I admitted. "Every decision feels weighted with significance, like I am defining my identity through furniture choices and paint colors." "Maybe you are," Maya said thoughtfully. "Not that furniture choices define identity, but that the freedom to make those choices without constant judgment and criticism allows you to express and explore identity in ways you have not been able to before. You have spent so long making yourself small and provisional. This is about learning to take up space without apologizing for it." Her words resonated with something I had been feeling but had not yet articulated. Taking up space, claiming resources in stability and permanence. These felt like acts of defiance against years of messaging that I should be grateful for less, that my choices were insufficient, that my desires were impractical. Moving into this house was not just a practical decision about housing. It was a statement about my right to inhabit my own life fully rather than living in the margins of someone else's vision for me. Over the following 2 weeks, I moved my belongings from the apartment to the house with help from friends who seemed genuinely excited to be part of this transition. Each carload of boxes and furniture felt like progress towards something significant. My small apartment had served me well for several years, but it had also reinforced a certain minimalism born partly of necessity and partly of not believing I deserved more substantial living space. The lake house, by contrast, had room for expansion and growth. I did not need to fill it immediately or create some complete vision of perfect domestic space. I could live in it partially furnished and gradually acquire pieces that suited my needs and preferences. I could leave some rooms empty for now and develop plans for them over time. I could experiment with arrangements and change my mind without feeling locked into permanent decisions. The first night I slept in the house felt momentous in ways both profound and mundane. The practical reality involved sleeping on my same mattress in a much larger bedroom with boxes still unpacked in corners. But the psychological reality involved claiming this space as genuinely mine, inhabiting property that represented both my grandfather's generosity and my own courage to step into possibility despite years of conditioning that suggested I should settle for less. I woke early that first morning and walked out onto the deck while coffee brewed. The lake was calm and reflective in the dawn light, and I stood watching the gradual brightening of sky and water while processing the magnitude of changes that had occurred in less than 3 weeks. I had discovered property I did not know I owned, confronted parents about years of undermining and controlling behavior, established boundaries that fundamentally altered family dynamics, and moved into a house that represented a completely different scale of stability and possibility than I had previously allowed myself to imagine having. None of this had been comfortable or easy. Much of it had been painful and frightening. But standing on that deck watching morning arrive over water that was now part of my daily landscape, I felt something that had been largely absent from my life for years. I felt proud of myself. Not proud of achievements measured against external standards, but proud of the courage it had taken to see clearly, speak honestly, and choose authentically even when those choices came at significant relational cost. My phone buzzed with a text message from my grandfather asking how the first night in the house had gone. I sent him a photo of the lake view from the deck and a message saying simply that it felt like home, which was true in ways I was still discovering. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever complications would inevitably arise from the fractured relationship with my parents, whatever difficulties I would encounter in learning to trust my own judgment without their input or approval, I was facing those challenges from a foundation of genuine security and support. I had a home that was truly mine. I had family who believed in my capability and worth. I had friends who supported my growth and autonomy. And I had begun the difficult work of believing in myself with the same conviction that others had offered even when I could not yet fully accept it. The lake stretched out before me in the growing light, and I stood watching it while drinking my coffee, beginning to understand that reclaiming this property was inseparable from reclaiming my own life, my own sense of possibility, my own right to occupy space in the world without constant apologizing or shrinking or deferring to others' visions of who I should be. This was just the beginning, but it was a beginning I had chosen rather than one chosen for me, and that made all the difference. The first month of living in the lake house passed with a rhythm that alternated between exhilarating freedom and unsettling uncertainty. Each morning I woke to the view of water catching early light, a sight so different from the brick wall I had faced from my apartment window that it still felt somewhat unreal even after weeks of repetition. The physical space of the house required adjustment in ways both practical and psychological. I had more room than I had ever inhabited as an independent adult, which meant learning to spread out rather than compress myself into minimal footprints. The practical challenges of homeownership revealed themselves gradually and required problem-solving skills I had not previously needed to develop. When the kitchen faucet began dripping persistently one morning, I faced a choice between immediately calling a plumber or attempting to diagnose and potentially fix the issue myself. My first instinct was to seek help, to defer to someone with more expertise and authority. Then I recognized that instinct as part of the pattern I was trying to break, the automatic assumption that I was insufficient to handle problems without assistance. Instead, I spent an hour watching instructional videos online and learning about faucet mechanics and common causes of dripping. I gathered tools from the basics that my grandfather had given me when I moved in, shut off the water supply, and disassembled the faucet with careful attention to how pieces fit together so I could reassemble them correctly. The problem turned out to be a worn washer that needed replacement, a $5 part that I purchased at the hardware store and installed myself. The total time investment was perhaps 3 hours including research, shopping, and repair work. A plumber would have been faster and more efficient, but the experience of successfully diagnosing and fixing something myself provided value beyond the functional repair. This pattern repeated across various small household issues that emerged during those first weeks. A loose door hinge that required tightening, a window screen that needed replacement, a clogged drain that responded to methodical application of appropriate tools and techniques. None of these were complex problems requiring professional expertise, but each one offered an opportunity to demonstrate competence to myself, to prove that I could handle the responsibilities of property ownership without constant assistance or oversight. My grandfather checked in regularly during this transition period, calling every few days to ask how things were going and whether I needed any support or guidance. His approach was notably different from what my parents' involvement would have been. He asked open questions about what I was experiencing and learning, rather than offering unsolicited advice or expressing concern about my ability to manage. When I described fixing the faucet myself, his response was simply, "Good for you. Learning to handle minor repairs saves money and builds confidence in tackling bigger challenges when they arise." The contrast with how my parents would have responded was stark and illuminating. They would have immediately suggested I call a professional, would have expressed concern about potential water damage from my inexperienced attempts at repair, would have offered to arrange and pay for proper service while subtly communicating that I was in over my head. Their help would have come wrapped in messages about my inadequacy, their support structured to reinforce dependence rather than build capability. Understanding this difference helped clarify why my relationship with my grandfather felt so fundamentally different from my relationship with my parents. He treated challenges as opportunities for growth and learning. They treated challenges as evidence of my insufficiency. He believed I would figure things out through effort and persistence. They believed I needed rescue and management. His faith in my capability created space for me to develop competence. Their doubt in my capability created pressure to prove them right through failure or to exhaust myself trying to prove them wrong. The silence from my parents during this first month was both relief and discomfort. They had not attempted contact after their final email confirming removal of their belongings from the house. I had not reached out to them. The rupture in our relationship remained unrepaired and unaddressed. Part of me felt guilty about this estrangement, influenced by years of messaging about family obligation and the importance of maintaining relationships regardless of dysfunction. Another part of me recognized that the silence was necessary space for me to develop independent perspectives without constant pressure to accommodate their narratives. Maya observed during one of her visits that I seemed different in subtle ways that were becoming more apparent over time. She noted that I made decisions more quickly, and with less apparent anxiety about whether they were correct choices. She pointed out that I talked about my life and my space with a kind of ownership and confidence that had been absent when I lived in the apartment. She mentioned that I seemed physically more relaxed, as though some constant tension had released. Her observations prompted me to pay attention to these shifts in ways I had not been consciously noticing. She was right. Decision-making felt less fraught now. When I considered paint colors for the bedroom or furniture arrangements in the living room, I could evaluate options based on my actual preferences without automatically filtering them through imagined criticism. When friends suggested activities or outings, I could assess whether I wanted to participate based on genuine interest, rather than on whether declining would be perceived as antisocial or difficult. The constant background calculation about how my choices would be judged by my parents had been operating for so long that I had stopped noticing it as a separate process. It had simply been part of how I moved through the world, an automatic assessment running parallel to every decision. The absence of that calculation created mental and emotional space that I was now filling with more direct engagement with my own preferences and priorities. The art studio I created in the second bedroom became a particularly powerful symbol of this shift. I had always maintained creative practices alongside my teaching work, painting and drawing in whatever small spaces I could carve out in my apartment. But those efforts had always felt supplementary and somewhat apologetic, hobbies rather than serious pursuits. My parents had been clear that art was acceptable as a leisure activity, but frivolous as a focus of significant time and energy, especially for someone whose career already involved art education, rather than more practical or lucrative professional paths. Setting up a dedicated studio space with proper lighting, organized supplies, and room to work on multiple projects simultaneously felt like a declaration that my creative work mattered and deserved substantial support. I painted more in the first month living in the lake house than I had in the previous year in my apartment, not because I suddenly had more free time but because I had space that invited and enabled creative work rather than space that merely tolerated it when I could squeeze it into corners and brief windows of opportunity. One Saturday afternoon, I was working on a large abstract piece that explored themes of constraint and expansion through layered colors and textures when my grandfather stopped by for an unannounced visit. I was initially self-conscious about him seeing me in my paint-stained work clothes with canvases in various states of completion surrounding me. Then I recognized that self-consciousness as another remnant of learned shame about taking my creative work seriously. He walked slowly around the studio, examining pieces with genuine interest and attention. His questions were thoughtful and specific, asking about technique and intention rather than offering vague compliments. Finally, he paused in front of the piece I was currently working on and stood looking at it in silence for several minutes. "This is remarkable, Natalie," he said finally. "Not just technically accomplished, though it clearly is that, but it communicates something important about transformation and growth. I can see constraint in these darker, tighter sections, and I can see the movement toward openness and possibility in how the composition expands and lightens. Is that what you were exploring?" The accuracy of his reading and the seriousness with which he engaged with my work brought unexpected emotion. No one in my family had ever looked at my art this way, as something meaningful and worthy of genuine attention rather than as pleasant decoration or evidence of impractical inclinations. "That is exactly what I was exploring," I said, my voice unsteady. "I have been thinking a lot about how we internalize constraints and how much work it takes to recognize and move past them, even after external barriers are removed." He nodded slowly, understanding the personal dimension of what I was describing. "Your parents told you for years that your choices were impractical and insufficient. Even now, when you are living in a beautiful home that you own and supporting yourself through work you find meaningful, some part of you probably still hears those messages and questions whether you are doing enough or being enough." "Every day," I admitted. "Every single day I have moments where I wonder if I am fooling myself, if they were right and I am just too stubborn or deluded to recognize my own limitations." "What do you do with those moments?" he asked. I thought about his question carefully before answering. I tried to look at actual evidence rather than at my feelings. I look at the fact that I successfully manage my responsibilities at school. I look at this house and the fact that I am handling ownership competently. I look at my friendships and the life I have built. The evidence suggests I am doing fine, even though the internalized messages tell me I am failing or falling short. That is exactly right, he said with evident approval. Trust evidence over inherited narratives. Your parents' assessment of your life was never accurate. It was always filtered through their own anxieties and need for control. The evidence of your actual capability has always been there for anyone willing to see it clearly. After he left, I returned to the painting with renewed focus and energy. His visit and our conversation had reinforced something I was gradually learning. The work of building confidence and trusting my own judgment was not about achieving some final state of certainty where doubt disappeared completely. It was about developing practices of returning to evidence and reality when doubt arose, about learning to distinguish between useful caution and paralyzing insecurity rooted in others' projections rather than in my actual limitations. The relationship I was building with my students that fall semester reflected these internal shifts in ways that surprised me. I had always been a dedicated teacher who cared deeply about my students' growth and well-being. But I recognized retrospectively that I had sometimes been tentative in my authority, second-guessing my instructional decisions and seeking excessive validation from administrators or more experienced colleagues. I had operated from a place of questioning my own expertise even as I worked hard to serve my students well. This year felt different. I made instructional decisions with clearer conviction, trusting my assessment of what students needed, based on my observation and experience, rather than constantly checking whether my approach aligned with external expectations. When I introduced a new project exploring personal identity through self-portraiture, I structured it in ways that honored diverse student experiences and expression styles without worrying excessively about whether the assignment would be perceived as sufficiently rigorous or appropriately aligned with standards. The results were remarkable. Students engaged with the project at deeper levels than I had seen in previous years, taking risks with their work and sharing vulnerably about their experiences and perspectives. Several students who had been disengaged or resistant in earlier weeks became invested participants, discovering aspects of artistic practice that connected with their lives and interests. One student in particular, a 15-year-old named Marcus who had spent the first month of school doing minimal work and projecting an attitude of contemptuous boredom, suddenly came alive during the identity project. His self-portrait incorporated photography, painting, and digital manipulation to explore his experience as a young person navigating multiple cultural contexts and family expectations. The work was technically sophisticated and emotionally powerful, revealing dimensions of thought and feeling that his earlier dismissive behavior had completely obscured. When I asked him what had shifted, he said simply that this was the first time a school assignment had felt like it was actually about his real life rather than about performing what teachers wanted to see. That distinction resonated with my own recent learning about the difference between authentic expression and performed acceptability. I shared with him in age-appropriate ways that I was also working on trusting my own perspective rather than constantly filtering it through others' expectations, and that his willingness to create honest work rather than safe work had taught me something valuable about the importance of that practice. These teaching experiences reinforced the interconnection between my personal growth and my professional effectiveness. As I became more confident in my own judgment and less controlled by internalized criticism, I became more able to create classroom environments where students could take similar risks. As I practiced distinguishing between useful feedback and projections of others' anxieties onto my choices, I became better able to help students make those same distinctions in response to peer and adult input on their work. The second month in the lake house brought new challenges that tested my developing confidence in different ways. A significant storm caused a tree branch to fall on the roof, creating damage that required professional repair. The insurance process was complex and somewhat overwhelming, involving assessments and estimates and negotiations that I had never navigated before. My first instinct was to ask my grandfather to handle it or at least to guide me through every step. Instead, I pushed myself to learn the process independently, calling the insurance company myself, scheduling assessors, reviewing estimates, and ultimately making decisions about repairs and contractors. The process was frustrating and time-consuming and occasionally confusing, but working through it provided concrete evidence that I could handle complex practical challenges that fell outside my existing expertise. I made some mistakes in the process, initially accepting an estimate that my grandfather later helped me recognize as inflated. But I learned from those mistakes rather than treating them as confirmation of inadequacy. This distinction felt crucial. Mistakes were information and learning opportunities, rather than proof of fundamental insufficiency. By the time the repairs were completed and the insurance claim was settled, I had developed genuine confidence in my ability to manage property ownership challenges. This was not theoretical or aspirational confidence based on hoping I would be able to handle things. This was earned confidence grounded in actual experience of working through difficulty and achieving functional outcomes, even when the process was imperfect. As fall progressed toward winter, I began thinking about the holidays and what they would look like given the current estrangement from my parents. Previous years had involved obligatory family gatherings that were rarely enjoyable, but that I had participated in out of a sense of duty and an inability to imagine viable alternatives. This year, for the first time, I had the option to create something different, to define holidays according to my own preferences and values rather than according to family expectations. I talked with Maya about hosting a Thanksgiving gathering at the lake house, inviting friends who did not have family nearby, or who wanted alternative holiday experiences that were less focused on traditional family structures. The idea felt simultaneously exciting and transgressive, as though choosing to celebrate differently was a radical act rather than a simple preference. Maya was enthusiastic about the idea and helped me plan a menu and coordinate invitations. We invited 8 people total, a mix of friends from various contexts who all shared the quality of being thoughtful, genuine people who would contribute to creating a warm and authentic gathering, rather than a performative holiday celebration. Everyone accepted the invitation with evident pleasure, several people mentioning that they had been dreading traditional family obligations and were grateful for an alternative. The preparation for this gathering became an exercise in trusting my own taste and hospitality instincts rather than trying to replicate some idealized vision of impressive entertaining. I cooked dishes I actually enjoyed making rather than dishes that seemed most impressive or sophisticated. I set the table with my mismatched second-hand dishes rather than feeling inadequate about not having formal matching china. I created a playlist of music I genuinely liked rather than music that seemed appropriately refined for dinner parties. The gathering itself was everything I had hoped it would be. Conversation flowed easily, moving between serious topics and humor, without the strained quality that had characterized family dinners where everyone performed their assigned roles. People helped with cooking and cleanup without needing to be asked, creating the kind of collaborative and relaxed atmosphere that emerges when gathering is about genuine connection, rather than about demonstrating hosting capability. Several people mentioned at various points during the evening that this felt like what holidays were supposed to feel like. Warm and inclusive and real, rather than obligatory and performative. After everyone left and I was cleaning the kitchen in the quiet house, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with having executed an impressive event, and everything to do with having created space for authentic connection and chosen celebration. This was what I wanted my life to feel like. Not perfectly curated or impressively accomplished, but genuinely aligned with my values and nourishing to my relationships and sense of purpose. The contrast with how my parents would have approached holiday hosting was instructive. They would have focused on impressive presentation, on demonstrating sophistication and good taste, on ensuring that every element communicated success and refinement. The experience of guests would have been secondary to the image created. Enjoyment would have been less important than impression management. I had spent so many years unconsciously absorbing their priorities, and assuming those were the only legitimate measures of successful living. Learning to identify and honor different priorities, to value authenticity and connection over performance and impression, felt like recovering a part of myself that had been suppressed so long I had forgotten it existed. As I finished cleaning and prepared for bed that night, I realized something significant. I had not thought about my parents' approval or disapproval at all during the entire planning and execution of the Thanksgiving gathering. Their imagined judgment had not been part of my decision-making process. I had simply done what felt right and good to me, and the result had been lovely. This absence of their voices in my head, this growing capacity to act from my own center rather than in reaction to their real or imagined criticism, represented progress that was at least as important as any concrete accomplishment. The lake was dark and still beyond the windows, and I stood looking out at it for several minutes before turning off the lights and heading upstairs to bed. I was building something here, Not just a physical home but a way of being in the world that felt increasingly authentic and sustainable. The foundation was becoming solid. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I was learning to meet them from a place of genuine capability, rather than from defensive insecurity. And that capacity, hard-won through confronting difficult truths and making uncomfortable choices, was proving to be worth every bit of the cost it had required. Winter arrived with the kind of gray persistence that characterizes the Pacific Northwest, transforming the lake view from brilliant and dynamic to subdued and contemplative. The water took on darker tones that reflected the heavy skies, and the deciduous trees along the shoreline stood bare against the muted landscape. This seasonal shift created a different kind of beauty, quieter and more introspective than the vivid colors of autumn that had accompanied my first months in the house. The rhythm of my days had settled into patterns that felt increasingly natural and sustainable. Morning routines involved coffee on the deck regardless of weather, wrapped in layers when the temperature demanded it, watching the lake and the sky shift through their subtle variations of gray and silver. The commute to school had become familiar enough that I no longer needed to consciously navigate it, which freed mental space for thinking through lesson plans or processing whatever personal reflections were demanding attention. Evenings were spent grading student work, preparing for the next day's classes, and increasingly, working in my studio on paintings that were becoming more ambitious and technically complex, as I devoted more consistent time and energy to developing my practice. The relationship with my parents remained fractured and unaddressed. 3 months had passed since the confrontation in their living room, 3 months without any communication beyond the brief logistics emails about removing their belongings from the lake house. Part of me had expected that they would eventually reach out with some attempt at reconciliation or at least at reopening dialogue. The silence suggested either that they were waiting for me to make the first move, or that they genuinely did not recognize the severity of what they had done, and saw no need to repair what they did not consider broken. My grandfather and I had discussed this ongoing estrangement during one of our regular check-ins. He had asked directly whether I was comfortable with the continued separation, or whether I felt pressure to initiate contact and attempt repair. His question was characteristically free of judgment about what I should do, simply an invitation to examine my actual feelings rather than my sense of obligation. I had told him honestly that I felt conflicted. The part of me that had been trained since childhood to prioritize family relationships and to accommodate others' needs even at cost to my own well-being felt guilty about the estrangement and anxious about potentially permanent damage to those relationships. Another part of me, the part that was growing stronger through the experience of living independently and trusting my own judgment, recognized that repair could not be authentic unless my parents acknowledged what they had done and demonstrated genuine understanding of why it had been harmful. My grandfather had listened carefully, and then offered a perspective that helped clarify my thinking. He noted that reconciliation required 2 things that currently did not exist in this situation. First, it required acknowledgement from the people who had caused harm that they had indeed caused harm, and that the harm was significant rather than trivial or imagined. Second, it required some evidence of changed understanding or behavior that would prevent repetition of similar harm in the future. Without those elements, reconciliation was simply a return to previous dysfunctional patterns, which might reduce immediate discomfort, but would ultimately perpetuate the underlying problems. His framing helped me recognize that my guilt about the estrangement was misplaced. I was not responsible for repairing a breach that I had not created. My parents had lied to me for 8 months, had used my property without permission, had destroyed a personal letter meant for me, and had refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing even when confronted with clear evidence. They had created this situation through their choices, and their continued refusal to take responsibility for those choices. My boundary setting was a reasonable response to unreasonable behavior, not an overreaction or a failure of family loyalty. Understanding this intellectually was easier than fully accepting it emotionally. The internalized messages about family obligation, and the importance of forgiveness, and the assumption that maintaining relationships was more important than maintaining boundaries were deeply rooted and persistent. I found myself having to repeatedly return to evidence and reason when guilt or anxiety arose, reminding myself that healthy relationships required honesty and accountability, not just continued connection regardless of behavior. In early December, something happened that disrupted my gradually stabilizing routines and forced me to confront dimensions of the situation I had not yet fully processed. I received a letter in the mail. Not an email but an actual physical letter in a handwritten envelope. The return address was my parents' house, but the handwriting was not either of theirs. I opened it with confusion and growing apprehension. The letter was from my aunt, my mother's younger sister Catherine, who lived in Seattle with her husband and 2 teenage children. Catherine and I had never been particularly close, separated by geography and by the fact that my parents had not encouraged close relationships with extended family members they could not fully control. But Catherine had always been kind to me during the occasional family gatherings where we had overlapped, and I had sensed that she saw and questioned some of the dynamics in my immediate family even if she had never directly addressed them. The letter began with an acknowledgement that she was inserting herself into a situation that was technically not her business, but that she felt compelled to share some information that I might not have, and that might be relevant to my understanding of recent events. She wrote that she had spoken with my mother several times over the past few months and had become increasingly concerned about what she was hearing, and more importantly, about what she was not hearing. According to Catherine, my mother had been presenting the estrangement to extended family and friends as a situation where I had overreacted to a minor miscommunication about property management and had cut off all contact in a display of dramatic immaturity. My mother had apparently positioned herself and my father as the injured parties, parents who had tried to help their difficult daughter, and had been punished for their efforts with rejection and coldness. This narrative had been repeated consistently enough that most of the family had accepted it as accurate, viewing me as ungrateful and unreasonable without knowing any details of what had actually occurred. Catherine wrote that she had initially accepted this version of events because she had no reason to question it, and because it aligned with certain patterns she had observed in my behavior over the years. I had always seemed somewhat distant and difficult to connect with, which she now recognized might have been the result of dynamics in my immediate family rather than inherent personality traits, but which had made the narrative of me being unreasonable seem plausible. What had shifted her perspective was a conversation she had with my grandfather at a family funeral for a distant relative that I had not attended. Catherine had expressed concern about the situation with me, repeating some of what my mother had said, and my grandfather had responded with uncharacteristic directness that the situation was not at all what my mother was representing, and that I had been entirely justified in establishing boundaries after discovering serious deception and boundary violations. He had not provided details, respecting my privacy and my right to share or not share the specifics as I chose. But he had been clear enough that Catherine understood the situation was significantly more serious than a minor miscommunication, and that my response had been proportionate rather than dramatic. She had subsequently pressed my mother for more accurate information, and my mother had eventually reluctantly acknowledged that there had been some confusion about a property that my grandfather had purchased, but that I was blowing the whole thing out of proportion and refusing to be reasonable about what had been an honest mistake. Catherine wrote that even this minimal additional information had been enough to shift her understanding substantially. She recognized that my mother was minimizing and distorting what had actually happened, and she had started questioning other narratives she had been told over the years about my behavior and choices. She wrote that she was reaching out because she wanted me to know that at least one person in the extended family understood that I was not the problem in this situation, that she was sorry for having accepted the distorted narrative without questioning it, and that she was available if I ever wanted to talk or needed support. The letter ended with her contact information and an invitation to reach out if and when I felt ready, with no pressure or expectation but simply an offer of connection from someone who was beginning to understand that family narratives were not always accurate or complete. I read the letter 3 times, processing layers of information and implication. The fact that my parents were actively managing the narrative with extended family was not surprising, but seeing it documented in detail was clarifying. They were not simply refusing to acknowledge wrongdoing privately. They were actively constructing a public story that positioned them as victims and me as the aggressor. This was not passive denial or rationalization. This was active reputation management and reality distortion. The fact that Catherine had questioned the narrative after a single conversation with my grandfather demonstrated how fragile the constructed story actually was. It only held up as long as nobody asked direct questions or sought additional perspectives. The moment someone checked the narrative against other sources of information, it began to crumble. This suggested that my parents knew on some level that their version of events would not withstand scrutiny, which was why they needed to control the narrative so carefully. Most significantly, Catherine's letter revealed that this pattern of distortion was not limited to the current situation. She had mentioned starting to question other narratives she had been told over the years about my behavior and choices. This suggested a longer history of my parents shaping family understanding of who I was, and how I operated in ways that served their needs rather than reflecting reality. I had been characterized as difficult, distant, and unreasonable not because I actually possessed those qualities but because those characterizations justified my parents' treatment of me and deflected attention from their own behavior. The realization was both validating and disturbing. Validating because it confirmed that the patterns I had been recognizing in my immediate relationship with my parents extended more broadly into how they managed family narratives and relationships. Disturbing because it meant that much of what extended family believed about me was based on carefully curated misinformation rather than on actual knowledge of who I was. I was unsure how to respond to Catherine's letter. Part of me wanted to reach out immediately and tell her the full story, to correct the record and ensure that at least one person in the extended family understood what had actually happened. Another part of me was exhausted by the thought of having to justify and explain myself, of having to prove that I was not the difficult and unreasonable person I had been portrayed as being. I called Maya to talk through my reaction and figure out what felt right to do. She listened as I read her the letter and described my conflicting impulses, then offered her characteristically clear perspective. "You do not owe anyone your story," she said firmly. "Not Catherine, not other family members, not anyone. What happened between you and your parents is your experience to share or not share as you choose. The question is not whether you owe Catherine information. The question is whether having an ally in the family who understands the truth would be valuable to you, and whether you trust Catherine enough to be vulnerable with her about what actually happened." Her reframing helped me recognize what was actually at stake in responding, or not responding to Catherine's letter. This was not about correcting the record or managing my reputation within the family. This was about whether I wanted connection with someone who seemed to be offering genuine understanding and support, and whether that potential connection was worth the risk and effort of sharing difficult and personal information. I decided to respond not immediately but after taking several days to think through what I wanted to say, and how much detail felt appropriate to share. The letter I eventually wrote to Catherine was careful and somewhat guarded, but it was honest about the basic facts of what had happened. I explained that my grandfather had purchased a lake house and put it in my name, that my parents had been given all documentation and keys with instructions to help me understand the gift, that they had instead hidden the property from me for 8 months while using it as their personal retreat, and that they had destroyed a personal letter my grandfather had written to me explaining his intentions. I described the confrontation when I discovered what had happened and my parents' refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing or show genuine remorse. I explained that I had established boundaries not to punish them but to protect myself from ongoing manipulation, and to create space for developing my own sense of reality without constant gaslighting and distortion. I noted that I understood this might not be the complete picture Catherine needed to fully evaluate the situation, but that sharing even this much felt vulnerable and difficult given the years of having my perceptions and experiences dismissed as dramatic or inaccurate. I sent the letter and tried not to obsess about what response I might or might not receive. Catherine replied within a week with a message that was both compassionate and appropriately outraged on my behalf. She wrote that what I had described was not a minor miscommunication or an honest mistake. It was serious betrayal that would have damaged any relationship regardless of family connection. She apologized for having accepted my mother's narrative without questioning it, and she acknowledged that this probably was not the first time my reality had been distorted to serve my parents' needs. She shared some of her own observations about family dynamics over the years, patterns she had noticed but not fully understood or named. She described seeing my mother manage information and control narratives in ways that seemed designed to maintain certain images and prevent people from forming independent assessments of situations. She mentioned feeling sometimes like she was getting curated versions of events rather than actual information, and wondering what was being omitted or reshaped, but not feeling confident enough to challenge the narratives directly. Her letter validated something I had suspected but had not fully articulated even to myself. The distortion of reality was not limited to how my parents treated me. It was a broader pattern of how they managed relationships and maintained control. They shaped narratives, managed information flow, and constructed carefully controlled images that served their needs, while preventing people from seeing situations clearly enough to question or challenge their behavior. Recognizing this as a pattern rather than as isolated incidents related specifically to me helped reduce the personal shame and self-doubt I had been carrying. I had spent years wondering what was wrong with me that I could not seem to satisfy my parents or live up to their expectations, internalizing the message that I was fundamentally insufficient or flawed. Understanding that their criticism and disappointment were tools for maintaining control, rather than accurate assessments of my worth or capability, reframed everything. This was not about me being inadequate. This was about them needing to position me as inadequate to justify their control and management of my life, and to deflect attention from their own problematic behavior. My supposed insufficiency served their narrative needs. Acknowledging my actual competence and capability would have required them to give up control and accept me as an autonomous adult with valid perspectives that might differ from theirs. The correspondence with Catherine continued over the following weeks, developing into a genuine relationship rather than just an exchange of information about family dysfunction. She shared aspects of her own life and challenges, and I found myself opening up about my teaching work, my creative practice, and my experience of building a life that felt increasingly authentic and aligned with my values. The connection was nourishing in ways I had not fully anticipated, providing a sense of family relationship that was based on genuine mutual interest and respect rather than on obligation or performance. Through these conversations, I began to understand more clearly what healthy family relationships could look like. Catherine asked real questions about my life because she was genuinely curious about my experiences and perspectives. She offered support without attaching conditions or expectations. She respected my boundaries and my autonomy while also being present and engaged. She disagreed with some of my choices, particularly my decision to maintain distance from my parents without attempting mediation or family therapy, but she expressed those disagreements respectfully and ultimately supported my right to make decisions based on my own assessment of what I needed. This stood in sharp contrast to how my parents had operated. Their questions had always been veiled judgments or redirections toward what they preferred. Their support had always come with strings attached and expectations about how I would demonstrate appropriate gratitude. Their respect for my boundaries had been non-existent, with my attempts to establish limits treated as evidence of my difficulty rather than as legitimate expressions of my needs. As the winter holidays approached, Catherine invited me to join her family for Christmas if I wanted an alternative to spending the holiday alone, or felt ready for limited family connection in a safer context. I was touched by the invitation and tempted by the prospect of experiencing family gathering that might be genuinely warm rather than performatively perfect. After considerable thought, I accepted, viewing it as an opportunity to test whether family connection could feel nourishing rather than depleting when it occurred in healthier relational contexts. The Christmas gathering at Catherine's house was revelatory in its ordinariness. The house was decorated but not perfectly styled. The meal was good but not elaborate or impressive. The conversation was easy and genuine, moving between serious topics and humor, without the constant performance of family harmony that had characterized gatherings with my parents. Catherine's teenage children were funny and slightly awkward in the way that teenagers typically are, not polished or trained to present particular images but simply allowed to be themselves. I found myself relaxing in ways I rarely had at family events, not constantly monitoring my behavior or filtering my comments through assessment of how they would be received. When I mentioned my teaching work, Catherine's husband asked genuine questions about challenges and rewards rather than subtly suggesting I should have pursued a more lucrative career. When I described working on a new painting series, Catherine's daughter asked to see photos and offered thoughtful observations about the work, rather than polite but dismissive compliments. This was what I had been missing, what I had thought was not possible in family contexts. This was connection without performance, acceptance without conditions, interest without judgment. Being in this environment made clear just how dysfunctional and damaging the dynamics with my parents had been. I had normalized constant criticism, conditional acceptance, and performance pressure, because those had been the only family dynamics I had experienced consistently. Seeing an alternative helped me understand that the problem had never been that family relationships were inherently difficult or limiting. The problem had been that my particular family relationships with my parents were built on fundamentally unhealthy patterns. On the drive home from Catherine's house that evening, I felt something shift in my understanding of what I had lost, and what I had gained through the estrangement from my parents. I had lost relationships that had provided certain forms of support, however conditional and manipulative that support had been. I had lost connection to family history and traditions, however problematic those traditions had sometimes felt. I had lost the comfort of familiar patterns, however dysfunctional those patterns had been. But I had gained clarity about what healthy relationships could look like. I had gained freedom to develop my own perspectives and trust my own judgment. I had gained space to discover who I actually was beneath layers of performance and accommodation. I had gained the possibility of building chosen family connections based on genuine mutual care, rather than on obligation and control. The balance felt increasingly clear. What I had lost had been costing me in ways I had not fully recognized because the cost had been distributed across years of gradually diminishing confidence and autonomy. What I had gained was creating possibilities that had not existed, while I remained enmeshed in dysfunctional family patterns. The grief about what had been lost was real and legitimate, but so was the relief and hope about what was becoming possible. As I drove through the dark winter evening toward the lake house that represented both my grandfather's generosity and my own courage to claim what was rightfully mine, I understood with increasing clarity that I was not moving away from family. I was moving toward healthier and more authentic ways of being in relationship with people who saw and valued me accurately. That movement required leaving behind people who could not or would not relate to me in healthy ways. But it also opened space for relationships that nourished rather than depleted, that supported growth rather than demanded conformity, that celebrated authenticity rather than rewarded performance. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.